So I guess what I do is, I would probably call myself an educator or a teacher. And I guess it was sort of a bit of an accident because I wasn't one of those kids that grew up wanting to be a teacher. I didn't, that wasn't my goal in life. I'm generally fairly introverted, so even the amount of on-stageness you do as a teacher is a stretch for me. So I thought that I was going to work in a museum. My undergraduate degree is in art history, and my idea was to work in a museum working with native arts. That's kind of what I wanted to do. But by the time I finished graduate school, I had done some of my dissertation research working in K-12 schools on a couple different reservations in northern Wisconsin. And I kind of started to really sense the power of teaching and the kind of impact that you can have. I finished my degree and I continued to work for the university for a while as a researcher. And then the grants that I was working on sort of ended. And then it was time to find a job. And based on sort of the work that I'd done on my dissertation, working in a K-12 environment seemed like it made sense. So I got a job at the Indian Community School, which is a intertribal urban American Indian school in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I worked in the library, but I think primarily the work that I did was supporting teachers to integrate American Indian Studies into all of the classrooms and all of the grades. And that was, so for that purpose, my background in American Indian Studies was the most relevant. So I was kind of like a content expert in American Indian Studies, and I worked with teachers. So I wasn't a classroom teacher myself, but I worked with teachers and did a curriculum development and team teaching, and we worked on developing standards related to American Indian Studies. So, and then while I was, working in a K-12 school, I thought back a bit about the bit that I taught when I was a graduate student, and decided that maybe I would want to try being in a college or university setting. So eventually I got the job that I have now at St. Cloud State University. Currently I'm an associate professor. I teach American Indian Studies for the Department of Ethnic and Women's Studies, and I'm the director of the Multicultural Resource Center. And the Multicultural Resource Center is an academic center, so distinguishing that from like a student services center. We're an academic center. We support students, staff, faculty, and the community as they're learning about, teaching about, or doing research about people of color in the United States. So this is kind of how I came to be a university professor. It's a bit of an accident, and I still have something of pre-stage jitters when I teach my classes. But I think the sort of belief that I had that this was a way to have a larger impact in the world turned out to be a true one. So even though now certainly my main job is teaching and supporting people through the work I do in the Multicultural Resource Center, I also find myself more as a broader public educator. I spend a lot of time talking to children and school groups and community groups, and seeing myself as an educator in the public sphere, not just in my classroom. So all of that was a bit of an accident, but it's turned out to be rewarding.
Can you say just a bit about the origins of your interest in art and art history and American Indian art?
Well, in my family, and I think a lot of Native families, many people are artists. They're not artists in the sense of somebody who has, an MFA or has that kind of training, but they're people whose everyday expression of themselves intersects with the arts in some way. So in my family, we have people who do music, people who are painters, people who do pottery, sort of runs the gamut of the arts. And so my uncle was an artist and a working artist. That's how he made a living. He primarily did paintings that were sold to tourists from our reservation. And it's interesting how sometimes those paintings find their way back to me. The very first day I got the job at the Indian Community School, my first day of work, I'm just sort of going around getting introduced to people, trying to get my office set up. And someone came to talk with me and said that they recognized my name. And they recognized that they knew that I was Dakota. And this was in Wisconsin, so there's far fewer Dakota people in Wisconsin. And they said that they had, I think one of their older relatives had given them a painting. And they wanted to know if I would be interested in it. And she brought the painting to me, and even at a distance I could recognize it was my uncle's work. And it was such a weird coincidence that on the first day of this new job in another state, this painting kind of found its way back to me. And that something similar has happened. I've had people contact me because of my last name is shared with my uncle. They've asked me, do you know this Reuben St. Clair? He was a big influence on me, and now I'm an artist. Or someone had a painting that they had purchased a long time ago, like a generation back. It had come to them through somebody dying, and it got passed down in families, and my uncle had a sort of a distinctive signature on his paintings. And so it's happened more than once that some of my uncle's work has sort of found their way back to me. But so anyways, watching my uncle paint, I remember, he would talk about, I remember I still have a painting he did for me. And he asked me, what, he was going to paint me something. And what did I want? And I was a little girl. And so I said a chipmunk. So he painted a chipmunk, and he painted it. And it was just amazing for me to be a little girl and to see something come from nothing in such a short amount of time. And then he hands me this finished painting of a chipmunk, which I still have. And so watching him paint, I think I was always really amazed by it. My aunt taught me the very sort of rudimentary basics of beadwork. And so I just saw in my family many people being artistic, but not in a formalized training kind of way, in a way that this is just how we are, this is just how we live. And I think that had a big influence on me. And of course, I've always liked, even as a young person, looking at art and talking about art. I'm more comfortable looking and talking and thinking about art probably than I am as an artist. But there are certain elements that I practice myself, but not because being an artist is a career path, but to me it's a sort of personal human expression.
My first aesthetics teacher said, the great cultures of the world have no word for art as a separate activity, or for philosophy for that matter, or for religion. They're together. It's a very odd thing to separate this out. I'm curious how it was for your family to not separate it out. I mean, how art and life came together.
I think it's true. I think that if you were sort of raised in sort of a Western way of thinking about things, to be an artist means you're very specially skilled above others, and that you have special training, and you have sort of a sanctioning maybe from someone, whether it's an art teacher or a school or something like that. And I think in my family we did not see it that way. What I observed was that everybody may have had a gift or even an interest, but that sort of, it was just a common expression. And part of it was, I think, still remnants of, even in my family, I see this shift. And so I do teach about Native arts and cultural expressions now. And so a big shift that we see in American Indian art is from making utilitarian objects that are made to be beautiful, to honor both yourself as the maker, but to especially to honor the person that's getting the thing that you've just made. And what happened is, over time, really because of the access that white people had to Native communities through roads or railroads, we start seeing non-Native people visiting Native communities, and when they're there, they want to have evidence of their visit, and they also have been sort of indoctrinated in an idea in the United States that Native cultures are going to become extinct. And so we need to start collecting from them now before they're extinct. Then sometime in the near future, we'll be the ones that have an artifact of this extinct group of people. So if you combine this extinction thesis, kind of a growing consumerism, and a desire to have sort of physical evidence that you were in a Native community, that you met a Native person, we start seeing interest in people purchasing stuff that Native people made. And initially, Native people are making things to be used or to be given as gifts, but they all had sort of a practical purpose. And now there's like this shift that these things that were dolls for children to play with are now becoming art objects, or these rugs that are being woven and that are made into clothing are now art objects. And so we start seeing these kinds of shifts. So, for example, my uncle, who went to boarding school in Minnesota and was always sort of known and recognized as somebody who had a gift for painting, saw a way to have an income through selling his paintings. But of course, he's selling paintings that tourists want to purchase. And tourists typically want to purchase paintings of Indians. And so you can see how the marketplace kind of has an effect on his choice of subject matter. I remember visiting him, and he was painting a picture. It was a portrait, and he was telling me that he had this friend, and I believe this friend was a non-Native person who was also an artist, probably a self-taught, possibly artist, I don't really know. But he was telling me that they were having kind of a competition among themselves of who could paint the best portrait of Elizabeth Taylor. And it sort of makes you wonder, he's painting lots of wildlife pictures, which, as a very committed and respected hunter and trapper on our reservation, I know that his knowledge of animals are pretty superior to the average person. But also, and then he's painting lots of scenes with Native people doing kind of, things that white people wanted to hang on their walls. And so you can see how the kinds of things that he's painting to be sold, he's getting sort of directed by the market in a certain way. But if he had the opportunity to paint whatever he felt like without that pressure, who knows what he would have been painting. But I always remember that story of him. And I remember looking at this painting that he was making of Elizabeth Taylor. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking about your early ambition to work in a museum. Of course, museums in some ways perpetuate a bunch. In fact, they're at the tip of this myth that the stuff that Native people make is valuable and worth collecting, and these people aren't going to be all around very long, so we've got to kind of hold on. Yeah. And I'm curious, how you, when you were thinking about working in a museum, how you thought about what you might want to do.
Well, I had, thinking, when I went to school, I didn't know what I wanted to study really when I went to college. And I think back on it, I knew that I liked art a lot and I liked looking at it. However, I had very minimal experience. I'm pretty sure, if my memory serves, that I was never in a museum, a real museum, until I was in high school. And I remember going on a field trip, and I think I was probably in 11th or maybe even 12th grade. And we went to the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And that, I believe, was my first time being in a regular museum. Now, my experience with museums were a lot greater, because the reason that I got this in my head that I could work in a museum is that the Minnesota Historical Society had a small center on my reservation. We called it the Interpretive Center. And it was kind of a very small little offshoot of, many MHS museums throughout the state. And my aunt worked at this museum. Well, it really wasn't a museum. She worked at the Interpretive Center for much of my childhood. And so I have many memories of going to visit her, being able to go into the back room and see where things were stored, having access to the place outside the regular hours, and then just seeing my aunt works in a place like this. So I think it kind of gave me an understanding that this is something that you could do. I could do this job. My aunt did this job. However, when I compare, and the exhibits and things have changed greatly since I was a child, but it really is a tiny little institution compared to any kind of even moderate sized kind of art museum. But I think it just gave me it gave me permission in a way to think that I could see myself in a job like that. I think some of it also came from, I remember that first time we went to the Art Institute, and I was there with my English class, and my teacher we were with a docent, and we were going and looking at different pieces in the museum, and the teacher was asking us, really, like, what do you think this means? Or what might be the symbolism of this in this painting? They were asking us to sort of look and think deeply about the works of art. And I remember feeling like this is something I actually am really engaged by and actually was fairly good at, because I remember making suggestions on what it might symbolize or what the meaning might be behind this. And I think my teacher was surprised at how much I was raising my hand and talking, because I probably was a more quiet student. But I remember really enjoying that. So I think a combination of having a mind that thinks like that thinks about the deeper meanings of things, is sort of maybe more naturally how my mind works. I think that, and a combination of having been around artists, home-taught artists, self-taught artists, and then having access to this sort of my aunt's work at her interpretive center. I think all of those pieces together kind of made it seem like it might be a good place for me.
In your graduate work, you must have done a pretty big range of art history courses, right?
Well,
you get that kind of a degree.
Yeah, my undergraduate degree is in art history, and I have a master's degree in library and information studies, because at the time that was kind of the closest thing we had to museum studies. And then my focus on American Indian studies came in graduate school. So I was really starting to sort of shift away. What I wrote my dissertation on was, I worked with another colleague, and we developed a curriculum to encourage young Native kids to do oral history interviews. And really the larger point we were trying to make is that there's a lot of information in your community, and that's the kind of information you may not find in books and archives, but it might complement that information. So we're really encouraging them to think about alternative ways of learning and alternative ways of knowing. So yes, you can go to the library and find a book about fishing, and you can find a textbook that talks about the biology of fish. But if you talk to your uncle, he knows in this community a lot about where the fish are and what time of year and how the fish population has changed over time, that there's information in your community and in your family that we're trying to lend validity to that information and to put it alongside written ways of knowing. So that's what I did in graduate school. So I sort of, I think I was getting, I was much more focusing on oral histories and oral ways of knowing in my graduate work.
And what did you learn there? I mean, how did it work to try to encourage young people to seek out non-printed information from their own communities?
So we developed this curriculum that helped students sort of look at, so we would look at an example. We picked historical events from their own community and said, all right, here's some written information about this historical event. We got this from a book that's a scholar wrote, and we showed we had them look over an excerpt from this. And then we showed an interview that we had conducted with someone from the community that was part of that historical event. And we had them look at both of these things and talk about what information do we get from both, what information is different, how do they complement one another, but really trying to get students, because I think anyone who grows up in the United States or anywhere in the West, has a lot of messages that real, true information is written down. And I remember growing to school and hearing, them talk about this game, telephone, which really sort of denigrates oral ways of communicating. That anything that you've heard orally is probably incorrect. That there was, do you remember this game where you whisper something, it goes around, and then by the time you get to the other person, it's incorrect. And so we're really trying to lend more validity to oral ways of knowing, not to discourage them from reading, but to understand that you're getting different kinds of information, which is more engaging. They notice that there's more sort of detailed facts in one, or sort of specific kind of factual information, but that the oral interviews are really lending sort of a humanity to it, and that it's engaging in a very different way, and they get a sense of what it was like to be there and the feelings that people had, and that is just not seen in the textual example. So we taught them about the positive, or not the positive, but how oral ways of knowing can fill in what maybe some things that written ways don't express, and that they can work together to tell a more nuanced story. And then we had, when we worked with them on trying to start thinking of topics that they might interview this person about. And then we worked with them on trying to get them to ask open-ended questions. What's the difference between an open-ended question and a closed question? And we had them start writing questions and then checking them. And essentially trying to teach them that a good interview is asking questions that are eliciting a story. So you want to ask a question of your grandmother that's going to get her to tell a story. And in that way, you won't have to do a lot of talking. Your grandmother will do most of the talking. And so then we sent them out with tape recorders or video cameras, and they interviewed their elder and came back, and we had a little celebration honoring the interviewees, and then we took the tapes and sort of very simply indexed them and had them placed in the library, because we wanted that information to sort of be housed in that place that's where all the written information is. And so that's kind of the project that we worked on, and it was, I think the main thing that we got out of it was that, and I think this is a human story, is that most people I know will say, oh, I wish I would have asked my grandmother more. I wish I would have talked to them more. That sort of, once it's too late, then you have this sort of regret. Sometimes these things just don't come up in conversation. So your grandfather who was, your great-grandfather who was in World War I or the Korean conflict, you know, he may not talk about this unless you actually ask him about it. So we had students come back and reporting to us that their relatives had done amazing things that they never knew about, and they were certainly very proud of. And I think that was kind of one of our other goals, was that to sort of encourage students to develop these relationships with older people. And so some people are doing relatives. It's more common that they were doing relatives, but sometimes people would do an additional interview, and they might interview a neighbor or some older person that they live near. And just to sort of, they're always so surprised at what interesting lives these older people led. And of course, it just never came up. It doesn't come up if you don't ask, typically. And so we, and this project that I was working on was part of this larger National Institute of Health grant that was looking at reducing health risk-taking behaviors of Indian adolescents. And so kind of our idea was that we believed an interest in that understanding that there are sort of alternatives, or even hearing those stories of how their relatives survived difficult times, or how they got through adolescence, that those kinds of things might be beneficial or helpful information. So it was sort of, this curriculum was sort of a small piece of this larger project.
And with respect to the larger project of improving health, did you come away from that thinking that you had a blueprint, or at least some directional signs as to how to pull that off? Well,
so we did a longitudinal study, I believe over 6 years, where we would survey students year after year and sort of ask them a fairly long questionnaire about their behaviors, primarily knowledge, interest, and behavior, maybe you would say. And so some of the things that came out of it were things that are not shocking, but we had evidence that a protective factor for students, not because if we're looking at Native adolescents, they're not having heart disease. If they have health problems, it's because of their own risk-taking behaviors related to violence or alcohol and drug abuse, sexually transmitted diseases, those kinds of things. So we were looking at how to help students avoid those, or what factors might protect them. And one that's not surprising is what we would call like parental monitoring. So that would be survey questions like, my parents know the parents of my friends. My parents know my friends. My parents know where I am. Those kinds of, we had a Likert scale. And so that's not shocking, but of course to be able to provide that kind of evidence, and we shared the data with the Native Nation where we did the research, and we, on a regular basis, shared the results of our research with the tribe. And I think that's both helpful information, and it verifies what many people believe to be true. It could be information that's used for the tribe themselves to get other grant support to work on projects. The other thing I think we were very forward thinking and doing is really recognizing that when we did research in Native communities, the Native communities had the real authority over the information. And that's a shift that I think we're still sort of struggling with when researchers go into Native communities. What the previous experience for most Native people was that some researcher would come in, they'd get what they need, and then they'd be gone. And the benefits would never really come to the community. The community oftentimes wouldn't even know for sure what the results of the research were. And that it felt like it was a relationship that was not reciprocated, that really the researchers primarily benefited and Native communities didn't. So the other thing, as we were designing the research, we were going to work very diligently to sort of change that relationship, to make sure the Native Nation understood themselves as being the owners of the information. And even since then, when we've ever wanted to use that data to publish, we've gone back to the communities to get their permission.
I'm curious in a little broader sense about your relation to the folks back home, and as an academic, as an interpreter of life, as a scholar of various important features of Native life. Have you been accepted? Have you found a way of making the transition back and forth between St. Cloud State and the reservation? How's that gone for you?
Well, I think that it's a concerted effort. It doesn't just happen. Generally, there's a lot of suspicion, and I've had to just sort of prove myself through my behavior that that my education could be a benefit to the community, and that I'm not going to swoop in and tell them what's wrong with them and what they need to be doing as I'm some sort of expert. I think really what I've done as a scholar, though, is to sort of think more conscientiously about traditional Dakota values. So if I'm living my traditional Dakota values, it's not just when I'm at home. It's when I'm teaching in my classroom of primarily non-Native kids. It's when I'm in a faculty meeting. It's when I'm giving a public presentation. It's every aspect of my life. I should be using my traditional Dakota values to help my decision making. And I think that orientation towards living, not really working, just living, has sort of helped. I think that shows through to other Dakota people. So I try and use my access that I have to benefit Dakota people and Dakota communities. I try and use the information that I've gathered to benefit Native people. So we're currently working I'm on the board of directors of a Dakota organization called Dakota Wichocha, and it means Dakota Way of Life or Dakota Lifeways. And currently I'm working with them on a curriculum about land in Minnesota and relationship to land. And the name of the curriculum is Minnesota Makoche, the Dakota Homelands curriculum. And so the fact that I have experience working in K-12 schools, creating curriculum from when I was in Milwaukee, I can take that experience and make it relevant in this work. The fact that I am a Dakota Studies scholar, I can take that and make it relevant. All to the benefit, hopefully, of not just Dakota people, though, because we want this curriculum to be taught in the region, not just in Dakota schools where Dakota kids go, but we really want this to be throughout the whole state. And so, but my belief is that, when we look at the kinds of educational gaps that we have in Minnesota, my belief is we can and should, and we need to be making sure that Native kids are getting an education that's relevant to them and respectful to them. But if we're such a tiny percentage of the population that when 99% of everyone else that's around you is completely ignorant to your history, that continues to sort of pull you down. And so my belief is that some of the reasons our achievement gaps or our educational inequity gaps are so persistent is not specifically or solely because of Native students. It's really because of everybody else. And that really everybody else needs to sort of make the paradigm shift. So to get the rest of the Minnesota citizenry to have a deeper understanding of Indigenous experience, both Dakota and Ojibwe experience, it's really only then that we're going to be creating an environment where Indigenous kids can survive and thrive. So the curriculum, we definitely want it to benefit Native kids, but we also see this as part of this larger paradigm shift in the region of how we're going to make Dakota and Ojibwe, I mean the curriculum is specifically on Dakota, so to make Dakota experience see the light of day again. Because I think it's really in many ways been erased from the public consciousness. So this is a big project. This sort of paradigm, sort of helping, supporting non-Dakota people and non-Ojibwe people to sort of make this kind of paradigm shift is really a lifetime of work. But it is, I see myself sort of addressing this. The things that I really invest my energy in are things that I feel like are addressing this larger issue. So this afternoon I'm going to be giving a tour for the Circle of Indigenous Nations, which is here at the U of M campus, and I'm going to be leading a tour of some sacred sites in the Twin Cities area for the U of M campus community. And I've been doing this tour. I developed it when I was a visiting professor here a few years ago. And I developed this tour as part of the class that I was teaching. I was teaching a Dakota history and culture class. And so I had this tour that I just took my students on. And then other people heard about it and said, can we come? And pretty soon now the Circle of Indigenous Nations is saying, what about if we get a bus? And so I've been doing this tour for 4 years now, every spring and every fall. And there continues to be sort of ongoing interest in this. The tour we have scheduled for this afternoon is full. And the last several have been full. And I think that is, to me, a sign of a growing interest, but not just an interest, but a growing kind of commitment to among Native and non-Native people that we really actually have to do some work to learn about the Native peoples whose land we live on. And most people recognizing that they didn't get that in their K-12 education, and many of them didn't get that in their college education. So it's sort of, I think of, the sort of process of colonization that impacted Dakota lives and Dakota institutions is multi-pronged. And so, the way we sort of bring back to light and public consciousness Dakota experiences is going to have to be a multi-pronged effort as well. So I'm just one person doing what I do, but there are many other Dakota people doing this work in different ways.
What you said about the need to educate the non-Native people in order to make it possible for the Native people to thrive in schools, for example, seems really very helpful and important. I hung around at the edges of the old General College at the university for a lot of years, and I remember with what sincerity and goodwill and sometimes phenomenal effort people worked to try to make a place for Native folks. Maybe not successfully, but they tried. And how anxious they were to hold on to students who seemed to have promise of continuing, and the difficulties they had along the way. So I'm curious, how you think about that problem. Your aunt being at that interpretive center made it imaginable for you, and your being at St. Cloud makes it imaginable for Native people there to think about teaching at St. Cloud. And how do you see the issue of bringing Native kids into academic life, into higher education? How do you see that problem, and what do you find promising there? Because some of the statistics, I think, are kind of grim on that one.
Yeah, Minnesota's really pretty much towards the very bottom in the nation for graduating Native high school kids from high school. So, well, I mean, if I think back to my own experience, and you asked me about the relationship I have in my own community, I think certainly I had to learn how to do this code switching. What are the rules of behavior in this environment, and what are the rules in this environment when it's not explicitly explained? You just sort of figure it out. That's something that I think many people have to do, and certainly people of color have to do. And why it is we have to do that, I think that's the question many people will ask, but I think it is at least the case right now. I think certainly I would say all American institutions are racist at their core. And that doesn't mean they're full of ill-willed people. I think that's just how these institutions were built. It's the foundation that they were built on. So we really do have to sort of go back and look at our institutions and see how race is part of them. So I think a big educational institution needs to do that difficult work. Our disciplines, how our disciplines become racialized, or how race is baked into our disciplines, is another both challenging thing for us to think about as we try and create educational programs that are relevant to people that aren't white and aren't male. But at the same time, certainly I know I've heard from students to say, Native students will often say, I would have never survived if it weren't for this individual, or I would have never survived if it weren't for the American Indian Center, or I would have never graduated if it weren't for, they find different ways to survive. I think we need to sort of tap into what are those things, and how do we continue to support those things, even in times of uncertainty. Just when I think of, academic institutions in general, I think it really seems like we're in a place now of some major shifting. I think in 20 years, being a university professor is going to look quite different than it looked 10 years ago. And so we're in this place of, it seems like a great deal of changes happening, and it will continue to happen. But at the same time, we have to check ourselves when we think of learning institutions as another business. I think that's the thing that always worries me, because if that's the case, Native people are always going to lose out. Our numbers are so small that an institution is never going to find it. It's always going to be a cost. It's an investment that they have to make, and I always worry that because of our small numbers, and I see this in my own campus, that the groups that in the larger numbers tend to get a little bit more attention, but we have to keep making sure and reminding people that it's not an accident that our numbers are small. It's not an accident that our histories are unknown. It's not an accident that we have problems in our community associated with colonization. That this process is still ongoing, and it's still affecting Indigenous people. And so one way to do that is to sort of remind people that the land you live on, where your home is built, where you work, that those are Indigenous lands. And some people gave up a tremendous amount. They gave up a lot. And you or your ancestors, and then later you have benefited from them. And so it's not an accident that our knowledge, our sort of tendency towards being ahistorical in the United States it's not an accident. It's not because we have so many other important things to educate people about. There's just not time. It's a convenient way of not thinking about things that are unpleasant, or not remembering the relationships and the responsibilities that we have to people. So it can be kind of an uphill battle, but when I see, for example, this tour that I'm leading this afternoon, when I see that it is, it's been closed for a while, and when I see that there's a great deal of interest, and I'm sure there will be some native people on the tour, but they'll mostly be non-native. I mean, that's the way it's been in the past. And so when I start to see that there are non-native people who are like, all right, I'm taking some responsibility to increasing my knowledge of the indigenous peoples of this place, and that's my job to do. That to me are signs of this sort of paradigm shift that I'm looking for. And of course, individuals in education institutions may be on the forefront of that. But as they make shifts, what I usually tell people is like, who's in your sphere of influence? The people you work with, your family members, the people in your church or your spiritual organization. Where's your sphere of influence? And that is the place where you need to start sharing what we've learned today. Your children, maybe the teachers that teach your children. So, I often get asked to come and talk to classrooms, when I do enjoy doing that. But I know that impacting teachers has a bigger impact. So I've also worked on developing a workshop focusing on educators that teaches sort of the very basics of American Indian Studies and Minnesota tribes, Minnesota Native Nations, but with sort of the basics of it, and it's a 1-week workshop. And it is a way to sort of, get into the ways that teachers create curriculum and how they teach. And I see that as another way that I'm sort of using what I can do to sort of push this shift a little further. So that's when we talked before about, and I said I feel like I'm more of a public educator. There's sort of there can be a typical career path for an academic. You become an expert in something very narrow, and you teach about it, and you write books about it or articles about it, and you continue to do research in that area. Now and again, you might share that with outside of academia, but most of your work is done in sort of within this larger community of academics and students. And that's, I think, one of the things that I've done is I spend a lot of my time in working with the people outside of those institutions or in the larger public arena. And that is because that's part of my larger plan for the shift. That if I were to stay and do something very narrow just among other scholars of American Indian Studies or just other scholars of Dakota Studies, I think I'm making a bigger impact when I bring my message to the greater community.
How has your teaching of both Dakota history and values and Native history more generally, how has that been received? What have you noticed about the interface between, non-Native students, Milwaukee, St. Cloud, audiences, various places, teachers? What have you noticed about that how they respond, what they pick up on, what they have trouble with?
Well, I would say that in the course of my teaching, one thing is I'm a better teacher than I was. I would look at some of my very early teaching evaluations, and I think it was a combination of my being a new teacher and also the time period that I was teaching in, the sort of milieu of the time where I had much more examples of especially white men really reacting negatively to what I'm teaching, hostily, really angry, and that kind of coming out in my teaching evaluations. Now, I think I'm a better teacher than I was. Sometimes I would get from people like, it's so sad. It's too hard. You know, that would sort of be a comment that I would get from students. And I'm like, you know, I can't really pretty up Dakota history or Native history so that you don't feel so sad. It is what it is. However, I did take that feedback and changed my course in a way that in my Intro to American Indian Studies course, I ended talking about arts and cultural expressions. Only because I feel like I'm ending the course on a note of continuance, that this is when we look at Native arts and cultural expressions, we can look at a continuing history and a continuing experience of Native people as artists, but also continuing to take part in cultural traditions, that these things have not been wholly lost, as I think many people assume they have been. And I think that even though I rejected their critique that I should make it easier for them to hear it, I chose to sort of think, I reject that aspect of it, but maybe what I could do is make sure the class ends on a note where my students have it affirmed in their heads that Native people are still here and we're still Native. So, you know, sometimes the feedback is, you know, very problematic, racist, but even all of the feedback that I get, I try to really be thoughtful about and think about ways that I can use that to benefit my teaching. And I have not gotten those kinds of comments in the last 5 years. I think it's a combination of I'm a better teacher, I've designed the class a bit better, but I also think that the student population has changed from when I first started teaching, even from when I was in grad school. That I think my white students recognize at this point that they are going to be living in communities and working in environments that are going to be far more diverse than where they grew up, and that it is to their benefit to get a better handle on people that are different than they are. So I think some of it is just the population, the general population of young people is actually seeing that this isn't not just the nice thing to do, but it benefits them as well to be somebody who can interact in a diverse environment with some comfort and competence. So I think there's shifts all around. Now I do things like things that I would call, and I explain to my classes, decolonizing my classroom. So I make sure to learn the best of my ability to learn the names of my students. I encourage them. I greet them in a traditional Dakota way at the beginning of every classroom. I teach them how to respond and tell them that it's up to them if they want to respond or not, but typically they do. So we have a typical, the typical greeting would be hello, my relatives, and then the typical response would be hello. And so I teach my students how to reply to that Dakota greeting in Dakota, and I teach them at the very beginning and say, you can reply in Dakota, you cannot reply, you can reply in English, but typically they reply in Dakota. So I think there's little bits that I do to remind them, or essentially assert the continuance of Dakota people. And that I'm both a Dakota person and I try to live my traditional values, but I'm also a modern person. And I think even those two things together are a challenge to what they learned, not just from school, which I think they often do learn this from school, but certainly what they learn from just absorbing the world in the United States, that real Indian people are from the past, and there really aren't any real Indian people anymore, and you don't know any Indian people because if you did, they would be on a horse with a headdress, and if you don't see any of those people, then you don't know any Indian people. And so these little ways that Native experience and Native people sort of get erased, I'm trying to challenge that in my own classroom by reminding them that I'm a Dakota person and I'm a modern person. So, you know, there's different things that I do, and I think overall I think that sometimes it presses people's buttons a bit, but I think my response, or the responses that I get from especially more of the public sphere things, have been overall very positive. You know, what I can offer in a lecture or an afternoon is limited, but if I can get them to pursue it more on their own, or continue their own education, or to take advantage of other opportunities to meet with other Indigenous people to learn from them, that's good enough. So I would say overall the response is, it's getting better, and it's pretty good. I think it's pretty positive and supportive.
That resonates so much with my own experience as a teacher. The difference between encountering, in my case, among students in the classroom, and having a chance to live with them for a while, and just that difference is huge, and to get a sense of what sort of a community they create when they have the ability to kind of control things a little bit. Just the last thing I wanted to ask is, do you think there are good spaces around for white people to get to know Native people in that way?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly there are many opportunities to learn more. To get to know is different. And I think you making the effort to learn more might be the entree to getting to know. So I would, you know, I think the other thing is to check yourself, because I think people have a tendency to think they think they know what they think they know who's Native because they know what Native people look like. But if they really were to unpack that, what they know is a stereotype of what a Native person looks like. And if we were to line up 500 Native people, they look very, very diverse. And so some of it is, you know, you may know people who are Native and you may not know they're Native. But I would say for people who really want to become more involved, to take advantage of those opportunities, there's lots of them. I think Minneapolis St. Paul has many, many opportunities to become involved, to learn more. There's lots of nonprofit organizations. They're always looking for volunteers or supporters. They're looking for people to share the message that they're focusing on. I'm also on the board of directors of Dream of Wild Health, and we have it's an organization that's about Indigenous food, Indigenous agriculture, and Indigenous, essentially, nutrition. And you know, we depend on non-Native people, the good relationships that we have with non-Native people. We have a long relationship with Craig Hassel here at the U of M as a tremendous supporter, helping us with the nutritional interests that we have about encouraging Native people to continue to eat Indigenous foods. So we build relationships. With our numbers being as small as they are, to really make any kind of headway, we have to do it through relationships. And actually for Dakota people, it makes perfect sense. The word Dakota means ally. So this interest in creating alliances with other people, we've been doing that since we were created as a people. I think Dakota people are actually very good at making alliances. It's not, we have to, you know, the other side, the reciprocity that's needed in the alliance, that hasn't always been great here in Minnesota. But it's not too late.
Thank you.